Hey, what's up? PizzaLovingNerd here. One of the things you have to do to run any operating system on your computer is, well, install it. And because of that, the installer is an important part of the user experience and the thing that probably makes the most of the first impressions. Because let's face it, half of Linux YouTube is just YouTubers installing a distro and trying it out. And that's why it's going to be interesting to look at 3 new installers that have just came onto the Linux scene. First one is the installer for Crystal Linux, which is an Arch-based distribution. And then we have Fedora and Ubuntu's upcoming new installers. So let's just get to it. Alright, so the first installer we're going to be looking at is the Crystal Linux installer. I am currently running this through VirtualBox right here. I have not tried this distro out at all, so I have no idea what this installer is going to look like. However, here it is. It kind of reminds me of GNOME Welcome. Let's start it here, and we're going to select our language. Mine is American English. Oh, I'm an idiot. This is time zone, not language. I'm sorry, America, Los Angeles. And then keyboard layout. I would prefer if it defaulted to something. Like American's kind of a common layout and most distros just default to it. Okay, we create a username and password. And then of course we want admin and super user rights. And then we choose a desktop environment. There's a lot of options. I'm gonna go with the default, which is Onyx. I'm guessing that is the customized GNOME that is seen here. Network host name. Kind of forgot that you need to type that in an installer, I'm not gonna lie. And then we have just some extra options here. I'm gonna disable these because we're in a virtual machine. And now we get to disks. Now, if I was writing an installer, this would probably be the hardest thing to implement. So let's just go to manual partitioning just because I'm curious. Okay, automatic partitioning takes you back to this. So it looks like they're just going to be using gparted for the rest of the partitioning here. So the way this works is you set up whatever file systems you want. Let's say I want to make a home partition too. So once you partition everything through gparted, I just created 2 basic partitions real quick. You just set up what file system you want and you select what mount point you want. So I could do this for root and then this for home. So that is how that works. I'm just gonna go back to automatic. And then we get a nice summary of everything. And there it goes. So if I was doing this personally, I would probably have a VTE terminal in here, but those can be really annoying to work with. But it looks like they're using like a text box or something, text view, and then just having the terminal output get outputted to there. So that's the Crystal Linux installer. Let's now go to the new Ubuntu installer. Now, unlike the Crystal Linux installer, this is not finished yet. I don't think the Crystal Linux one is either, actually, but keep in mind, this one especially is not going to be finished because this is running on a daily build of Ubuntu. I believe it's 23.04. I really forgot how laggy Ubuntu is in virtual machines. Holy crap. Okay, so here's the installer. It's asking to choose my language, but it's not giving me any options. This is a daily build. This is probably just a bug. It just crashed. Hey, I do like the new wallpaper, Ubuntu. Alright, one relaunch later, and I do have language options now, so let's just continue. Try or install. We're going to install it. This is using Flutter instead of GTK. I really like how it looks. Connect to the internet. We're going to use wired. Are you kidding me right now? You got to be kidding me. And they say Ubuntu isn't a bloated distro. My love of Ubuntu is really showing in this video. Alright, now that we have enough storage, we get this screened. We can install third-party software and include support for extra additional media formats. But I'm just going to go with the normal installation, who cares? And then we have erase disk and install Ubuntu and then something else. So far, this just looks like a reskin of the current installer. It looks like they tried to go for the original design as close as possible so far. But I'm curious, let's go to the new partition screen. Ooh, I like this. Instead of bootloader device. Okay, I love this custom partition tool. This is actually great. And then once you select all your partitions, you just click start installing. And then you set your location and everything. This is just like the old installer. They didn't really do much on like the design front. It's basically the same as like the original GTK Ubiquity installer. It's just written with a different toolkit, which is Flutter, so it looks slightly different. And on the back end, oh wow. You set your theming in the installer now? That's weird. It even has the same slideshow animations and everything. But there should be some other changes in the back end. They're using something called Subiquity or something like that. Starts with an S. and that powers the back end of this installer. And I quite like it. The only thing I don't really like is I feel like the appearance light or dark thing is kind of out of place in this. Personally, for the installers I use, I prefer to do stuff like setting the username and password and everything after the installation, so that way if I'm trying to install it on someone else's computer, they can set that stuff themselves. Basically an OEM install, kind of like what Fedora does. But overall, I really like the new Ubuntu installer. Speaking of Fedora, Fedora's new installer is going to be the last installer we talk about today. Now, this is probably the furthest from being finished of all of the installers we've shown off. However, Fedora recently released a preview image of their web UI, which we're booting into right now as we speak. And here it is. It looks like there's like a menu for languages. Oh, what? Oh, I see. This is supposed to be like one UI element. It kind of looks like it's a menu. Like, this looks like it'd be a drop-down menu, and the drop-down's like open. Kind of confusing on the design front. But anyways, this is a web UI. The idea is that eventually you'll be able to install Fedora from a browser, mainly for Red Hat also. So this is more for the server side of Fedora and Red Hat and everything. It's letting us choose an installation destination. Don't see any way yet to add any extra drive options and change anything about your drives. So at the moment, again, this is the most experimental of all of them, but at the moment, you're forced to use automatic partitioning. Oh, okay, there's another screen. Okay, still no automatic partitioning. This is just a confirmation screen instead. Oh, and we're done. Okay. So it's more of a wizard-based installer, kind of like a Windows EXE installer, instead of what Fedora currently has, where you have to click to each category and set stuff depending on what you need. Like, you need to set your disks and everything, and then you do basically everything else once you're in the system, which is the way I like it. And this installer is kind of the one I'm paying attention to the most because I do maintain a Fedora-based distro called RizzyOS. Speaking of which, if you like these videos, you can support me by buying RizzyOS merch on its store. But because of RizzyOS, I will be paying attention to the development of this, because this likely will be the installer RizzyOS ships in the future if they go out and use this as the default. I do like how it looks. It's slick, pretty easy to use because a lot of people are confused on how Anaconda works. It can be complicated to install because you have to click on the different categories instead of just clicking next, next, next. And then some of the buttons are weirdly positioned, like the done button is usually positioned on like the top left instead of like on the bottom right, which you'd expect. However, this more wizard-based installer I appreciate a lot more, and I am looking forward to this being used in future versions of Fedora if they decide to replace the GDK installer with this. That said, there are some things that I'm hoping get changed. These things probably will get changed because this is an experimental ISO. For example, I noticed there was no live desktop. You just booted straight into the installer, and I'm hoping that's not the case. And then I hope they add, extra partitioning stuff. Another thing I did notice about this installer is that even though it doesn't have a live desktop, the ISO is like 4 gigabytes. However, I do not think that this will be an issue with later versions of Fedora, like non-test builds, where you boot into a live ISO and you run the installer on a desktop, because of the way that Fedora's installer works. When you boot into a live Fedora USB, it actually is booting a rootfs image into memory, and then on top of that, applying a script that does things like set it to read-only. And so when you're installing the system, it essentially just installs this rootfs image to the hard drive. However, the reason this ISO file is so big, I suspect, is because the Fedora system that it uses to run the installer is different from the Fedora system it's actually installing. It's a dev build, so that's why it says Fedora 38. And then the rootfs that it installs onto your system is from Fedora 37. So there's basically 2 Fedora systems on this ISO. One that you run to boot into the installer, and then one that the installer actually installs, and that's why it's 4 gigabytes. So this probably won't be an issue on future iterations of this installer. So yeah, those are 3 new installers in the Linux world. I believe OpenSUSE is also working on another web installer similar to this Anaconda installer. However, I didn't really research that enough for this video, and if I did, this video would be very long, so those are the 3 installers I'm showing off today. Thanks to my patrons, Sam Covett, Peckut, Frank, Jim Peter, and Mitchell Vantino. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'm out.